Chapter 17, in which Forewarned is Forearmed. They made their way out of the undercroft. Alicia moved from corner to corner using cover, gun drawn and ready. Horst stayed to the rear, his superhumanly acute senses honed and alert. Brothers Cabal walked in the middle with a poorly concealed air of impatience about him, like a father given charge of a pair of overactive children who had cleared out a sweet jar an hour before. They encountered no one en route. "They'll be on the battlements, enjoying the show by now," said Alicia in a whisper as she crept along, pistol held in a two-handed grip. "All of them?" said Cabal in a normal tone. Alicia narrowed her eyes at him. He was unabashed. "That seems unlikely." Horst appeared at his side in a localized weather condition of stiff breezes, forcing Cabal to straighten his hat. "Likely or not, there's nobody around. You suspect a trap?" "I always suspect a trap. That, however, is not my point. They will not all be on the battlements. Life continues for the servants, if no one else. We should be cautious." Alicia went back to leading the way, quite pointedly, unamused by the suggestion that she was anything less than diligent. Cabal was rendered entirely unrepentant by her sharp looks, as was his way, long exposure to sharp looks in general having lent him immunity. "I," he offered, "am of the opinion that we should split our force. I can make a couple of decent guesses where you are likely to find the officers of the Ministerium, and I can make a damn good guess where Maleficaris is to be found." "No," said Alicia. "We stick together." "That does seem more sensible," said Horst. "Isn't being divided a good way to be conquered?" "In the usual run of things, I would agree," said Cabal. "But we have time against us. We can be sure of the defenders' responses to the attack, and we know how they will climax. If it reaches that stage, our allies without shall shortly be fodder." "You mean Maleficaris," said Alicia. "Indeed so. If we stop him, the Ministerium will take the opportunity to rally their forces in a tight defensive shield about themselves or run. Either way, they will survive the night, and this whole cycle will start again in a few months when they have replaced their losses." "Alternatively, if we exterminate the Ministerium." "That sounds a bit ruthless," said Horst. "You could stay outside while Fraulein Bartos and I do what is necessary. By the time we're done, the attacking force will probably already be dead at the tentacles, mandibles, or whatever other excesses Maleficaris' latest recruits happen to be sporting. In short, we need to deal with both Maleficaris and the Ministerium at one and the same time. Thus, we must split our force." "He's right," said Alicia, very unwillingly. "So, who goes after who?" asked Horst. "Maleficaris is mine," said Cabal. "You will probably find the Ministerium in either the hall where you dined the first night, or in the room where you eavesdropped upon them. I shall find Rufus Maleficaris in the most melodramatic location available, because that is the nature of the beast." He walked off, leaving Horst and Alicia behind without a second glance. "So," said Horst in the awkward silence that followed, "that's my brother. What do you think?" The castle's defenders, which is to say the minimum wage earners of sufficient amorality not to care greatly that they were working for demonstrably evil people, got their first inkling that all was not well when the undisciplined mob of disenfranchised Mercarvians, approaching across the very same area of scrubland from which the D Society had launched the previous attack on the building, not only failed to be dismayed at the approaching horde of the undead, but instead took positions and stood ready for the counter-assault. Then, at a range of 50 yards, they opened fire. This was no panicked fire of dismayed common folk, but a disciplined and well-placed volley. The castle guard, viewing the action from on high, clearly saw many of the front rank of the zombie horde drop as if their strings had been cut. "They're shooting for the heads," said one guard. "Never mind that," said the sergeant. "They're shooting for the heads and hitting them. They've got marksmen down there. Where are my bloody field glasses?" Locating his binoculars, they were around his neck. The sergeant set to scanning the ranks of the attackers. There's something not right about this lot, he said. There's something a bit professional about all this. Hello? He peered off toward the edges of the common scrubland. Who are that lot? There's a bunch of women just standing around. One of the women was watching the engagement through her own pair of binoculars. She looked up toward the castle, and their gaze met through several sets of lenses and prisms. The sergeant had a faint premonition that this meeting did not bode well. The woman lowered her glasses and looked directly at him. She had a very intense look about her, and she seemed to be mouthing something. The sergeant was just noting that she was a very handsome woman, from somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean he would guess, when his eyes unexpectedly burst into flames. This distressed him, and he staggered around, blood-red fire erupting from the sockets, while he explained the degree of agony he was enduring and how much he would appreciate the assistance of an unspecified form from those present. Then his head caught fire, and his conversation became very scream-oriented. For their part, the other guardsmen looked on, crying much profanity and incoherent expressions of dismay and consternation. They did not help him, for they did not understand what was happening, and they were filled with fear. The sergeant fell with a final groan, and they stood and watched him burn down to dust. Out in the ranks of the attackers there was some dissent. Henry Palomer had made his way back to remonstrate with the Atropos Straka of the Medians. "Mademoiselle Straka," he said, a scoped rifle slung beneath his arm. "Miss," growled Miss Straka. "Miss Straka, you have tipped our hand." He gestured at the battlements. "Now they know we are not just angry local." "I think they were well on their way to seeing that when you started mowing down their zombies." "Ah, but that was suspicion. Now it is certainty. Why did you feel you had to break from the plan anyway?" She nodded castlewards. "He was looking at me." Palomer set his jaw askew while he absorbed this. "I am looking at you," he said, not unreasonably. There was a long moment during which they looked at one another. On this occasion, Miss Straka did not invoke the powers of Hades to immolate her observer, which was nice. Palomer sighed. "Lors," he said heavily, and returned to his place in the line. In a window in one of the towers, Lady Misericord, dressed in a fetching black shift, was joined by Devlin Alsager, dressed in nothing at all, which might also be regarded as fetching, depending on one's disposition. She was not required for the deployment of the undead, having shared that responsibility with the captain of the guard. Thus, she had not been called upon when the zombies had been sent out to remonstrate with their attackers. Instead, she had stayed abed with Alsager in one of the more remote guest rooms, and it was from here that she watched her creations being mown down and one of the sergeants burning up. Alsager stood behind her, his arms encircling her waist and his desire tactically very apparent against her bottom. He kissed her neck. "Come back to bed, my lady. The guards can handle this." "Can they?" She smiled slightly, but her eyes were active and intelligent, taking in the activity below. "I have my doubts." Below, another volley cracked out, and still more of the zombies stumbled and fell. The muzzle flashes gave her some idea of the attackers' positions in the deepening gloom. There seemed to be 3 sections she could make out. The center very defined, and flanks less so, and she could see movement further back still. A reserve, perhaps? She bumped her hips back coquettishly into him. "Get changed." Alsager frowned. "For dinner? I didn't hear the gong." She turned and, drawing his face down to hers, kissed him deeply and thoroughly. When she broke the kiss, he blinked as if waking unexpectedly from sleep. "Those shots were your gong," she whispered, "and your dinner waits outside the castle walls." He blinked stupidly once more and looked out of the window. "Oh," he said, comprehension dawning. "That sort of changing. You don't really think that rabble is such a great threat, do you?" "They're not rabble. And yes, I do. Alsager reluctantly let her go and walked, still naked, to the door. He was cut from a thoroughly heroic pattern physically, a model for saturnine bad boys throughout the world of romantic novels, and he knew it. That his heart throbbed with love primarily for himself, and his soul was a shriveled affair with neither here nor there. He looked wonderful, and was prone to wandering the corridors of Harslaws in tight breeches, riding boots, and an open, frilly shirt to prove it. Going naked was no great step from that. In any case, he would soon be suited in fur. Indeed, already his lupine nature was expressing in the lineaments of his face, and the hairiness of his buttocks above which the nub of a burgeoning tail was forming. He paused at the door. Misericord was standing by the window, her arms cradled across her stomach, hands to elbows as she watched the developing battle.
"You're not how I imagined a necromancer to be,"
he said. The words sounded rough and improperly fashioned, the fault of his palate extending and his larynx deforming. She didn't trouble to look at him. "Good." Alsager sensed an inevitable dismissal, and further, felt it wisest to comply. He left her, a dark form silhouetted against a dark sky. The undead were not faring well. The usual sense of ennui at being sent out to do battle was becoming tempered with a new and distinct feeling that they had not previously experienced. It was a slow realization, making its way through slow mental processes, mired in decay and maggots, but the penny was very gently dropping that perhaps they were losing this one. This hardly concerned them tactically. They had been given orders, and it was beyond their ability to do aught but obey. Nor were they subject to such living frailties as failing morale. They were already dead. Further, deadness was not something that bothered them unduly. There was, however, the remnants of the very human instinct towards curiosity, and they wondered in a nebulous sort of way how it was that their numbers were thinning so distinctly. Even deceased, the human mind searches for patterns and repetitions, and is sensitive to breaks in a sequence, to holes in the tapestry. Then, usually, such strange and tenuous ghost trains of thought were smartly brought to the buffers by a bullet traveling through the brain pan of the philosophical zombie, and that was that. Of the survivors, there was a distant inkling of something about running away from danger. It was an interesting thought, and they considered it with cobwebbed ratiocinations as they continued on to the guns of their attackers. Professor Stone watched them coming on, gauged their rate of attrition, and found it, while impressive, insufficient. "They'll be on us in a minute," he said to one of the reinforcements London had sent. The man paused to reload, thumbing rounds into his Winchester rifle. "Should we give ground, Professor?" he asked. He seemed very cool and resolute under pressure, the professor noted. One of the skilled and experienced reservist combatants and the Society's shadowy sponsors in Whitehall kept on call, no doubt. "Not just yet. With any luck, we won't have to." Behind them, over the rattle of disciplined fire into the zombie ranks, a distant drone sounded. As it grew louder, the image it brought to mind was the largest, angriest dragonfly imaginable, something from the ancient days before dinosaurs were dinosaurs, and not being aquatic still had novelty value. Soon, minor tonal variants in the droning gave the impression to the acute ear that perhaps there was more than one colossal angry dragonfly on its way from the late Carboniferous period, and it might be an idea to hide. Despite knowing the origin of the sound and knowing it was allied to their cause, the attackers still hunched slightly as the drone became a roar. The zombies, showing the polite interest of a politician at a primary school, raised their heads to look into the glowing horizon. What they saw there did not illuminate their ignorance at all. 3 black spots against an Egyptian blue sky that grew and diverged slightly as they did so. Then, suddenly, the black spots resolved into anemopters and flew directly overhead. Several of the zombies tried to track them by looking up so keenly that they fell over, as boggled as any troop of penguins overflown by an aircraft. The zombie advance halted in confusion and slapstick as the following ranks tripped over the freshly fallen or were knocked down like skittles. From her high window, Lady Misericord rolled her eyes with exasperation and went off to recover her dress from the chamber floor. On every fuselage, navigation lights flared. While it might possibly make them a little easier to shoot down, that was better than colliding with another entomopter in the gathering dark. Miss Montgomery's warbirds crisscrossed the sky over the zombies' heads, causing about as much dismay among their ranks as they had ever encountered post-mortem. Few people had much experience of being buzzed by low-flying aircraft, and the zombies had none. They were at a loss. Some wandered off in random directions, others waved wasted limbs in anger at their roaring tormentors, and many just fell over. The army of the dead that had left the castle now looked like an ill-starred attempt at a record for the world's largest rugby scrum. As in confusion they rolled around, one of the entomopters, striking dragon, performed a stall turn and headed directly for them. But while the striking dragon, piloted by the redoubtable Mink Choi, bears down upon the horde, we have time for a short and illuminating digression. There are several methods of imperfect resurrection. The poor, bastardized ways of raising the dead with which Brothers Cabal held no truck, while he searched for the path by which the dead can be brought back to life perfect in body, mind, and soul. Most, if not all, other necromancers contented themselves with ways by which the dead can be put back on their feet to do simple, repetitive tasks. Working on plantations, mobbing the houses of critics, or making unsolicited telephone calls to sell patios and double glazing. These were all examples to which necromancers of greater or lesser vindictiveness and commercial acumen had set their creations. Such resurrections were comparatively simple, but, as alluded to previously, there is more than one way to skin a cat and then bring it back to life should one be so disposed. Firstly, there was the classic voodoo approach. This hinged on ancient magics from the primordial past, held in the ritual of 1,000 generations in Africa, and then diluted unforgivably in the space of a handful of years by, of all things, Roman Catholicism. The rituals and necessities were relatively straightforward, if lengthy in commission, and, at the end of it all, one was the proud possessor of a quiet, diligent, albeit unimaginative and inflexible servant. There was the detail about never allowing the zombie to taste salt, or it would realize it was dead and wander off in a huff before returning to the soil. Still, that was a small detail, and easily attended to through a long needle, strong thread, and a few minutes spent sewing up the zombie's mouth. Practical, if aesthetically displeasing. Such creatures were rarely dangerous unless directly ordered to be so. Mass resurrections of the sort needed to raise an army were impossible. This, then, was not the source of Lady Misericord's powers. Next, we have the corrupted zombie, created by the agency of a parasite that usurps the body's architecture and uses the corpse as a vector by which to spread itself. These undead are, in essence, a virus writ large, subsuming humans to its cause of proliferation in the same way a virus does so with individual cells. No necromancer worth his or her salt, not even the underachieving ones, would stoop to such creations, firstly as a matter of pride, secondly as a matter of practicality. There is no controlling creatures such as these, no more than one may control a rabid dog. Next, there was, both to Cabal's knowledge and damnable experience, the form of undead raised by the infamous Ereshkigal working, upon which we have already touched. These were animated by a supernatural force of an atavistic nature, its primary concern being reproduction. Reproduction for zombies is aesthetically, fortunately, while practically unhappily, attained by killing. While the ritual keeps the lightest of leashes upon the growing mob of undead it creates, this lasts until the caster falls asleep, at which point the leash is slipped. The foolish ritualist is added to his or her own army by being murdered while dreaming, and the horde grows geometrically unless halted using extreme measures. Interestingly, these later stages of the Ereshkigal working are not mentioned in the rare parchments that survive. Most occultists guess that the very intelligence that animates the dead may well be the one that whispered the ritual into the minds of gullible Mesopotamian magicians all those millennia ago, and skipped the bit about an inevitable zombie apocalypse following. Misericord, however, had undoubtedly slept many times since creating her rotting regiment, and had never once lost control. She, at least, had the sense to leave the Ereshkigal working well alone. The next category was a narrow and unusual one. Machine zombies. Cabal had encountered their like precisely once, and was not keen to repeat the experience. These poor wretches were a combination of flesh and metal, the former enforced and directed by the latter, and the spark of life kept burning through the agency of electricity. They were, however, very easy to identify thanks to all the metal bits melding into the flesh on limbs and head. This, he had been assured by those with direct experience of Misericord's corpse of cadavers, was certainly not the case here. Thus, by a steady process of deduction, Cabal had arrived at the only remaining method by which he believed his counterpart within the Ministerium could have made her army. In any event, Cabal was certain that Lady Misericord had turned to good old-school diabolism, her wonder to perform. She had contacted a demon, probably the long-suffering Lucifuge Raphael. Here, Cabal was wrong. The actual demon who was summoned was one Ragtag Slyboots. The negotiations for Lady Misericord's boon had gone much along expected lines until the name Johannes Cabal had come up as a potential enemy. Ragtag had peremptorily torn up the agreement they had just signed and told her that her soul was hers to enjoy for eternity, and that she might have the power she sought gratis, a freebie from the pit. Thus, Cabal's penchant for making enemies in low places came back to torment him. It was hardly the first time. Sold her soul and gained powers thereby. This was an eminently understandable route to take if one sought only direct influence by the technique of setting zombies on anyone who presented difficulties. In research terms, it was an cul-de-sac, to coin a phrase, long since explored and abandoned by Cabal. Still, he had an understanding of what faced the, for want of a better term, taking in secret societies, assassins, a necromancer, and a vampire, good guys, far beyond that of the average man on the Clapham omnibus, who would be dismayed by zombies but fail to observe them analytically as they made their way up the spiral stairs to the top deck of the omnibus. Very dismayed. This was the state of knowledge upon which plans had been enacted. Just as the striking dragon was about to overfly the zombies, there was a metallic clink, audible even over the sound of the engine and the wings, and a cloud started to form in the Entomopter's wake. It was light and misty, and was whirled easily into complex curlicues by the turbulence of the aircraft's passage. Thence, it settled into a wide bloom, a ghostly ribbon that hung over the zombies until, with another clink, the ribbon was cut. That which had been laid fell slowly upon the creatures below, and so soft and fine was it, none of them noticed it. Not, at least, until it reached them. Then they certainly noticed it. Yes, indeed. From where it touched bare, dead skin, each tiny droplet took offense at the devilish nature of these particular examples of the walking dead, and manifested that offense by burning with a bright blue, ghostly flame of outraged purity. One tiny mote created one flare of azure about the size of a freshly struck match, and every zombie was hit with hundreds or thousands. With a great cry and a roar of supernatural combustion, Lady Misericord's army burst into flames. They staggered around, more so than usual, and when they staggered into one another, the flames combined and were magnified. Where there were stragglers, striking dragons sought them out and struck them down. Every pass laid down more clouds, and after every pass, the flames grew less as the tainted flesh burned, and the spirits of the dead were released to finish their journeys to wherever they were supposed to be going before the uncalled-for interruption of zombification. At a balcony, Lady Misericord watched the conflagration with tight lips. By her stood a bear of a man in tweed and unconscionable beard. "Holy water," she muttered. "How did they know?"
"Johannes Cabal," said the man.
"Of course. I had hoped they might use more conventional means, more time-consuming means."
"Cabal is a nuisance and a danger, my lady."
"Precisely. That's what Her Majesty in Crimson was counting upon. Still,
She watched a burning zombie topple into the moat. It continued to burn as it sank, a diminishing blue glow coruscating beneath the surface. I doubt she was expecting him to be quite this efficient. Off to the south, a howl shuddered through the night. Lady Misericord nodded and allowed herself a small smile. Ah, finally. Alsager has got his animals together. Perhaps things will go back onto schedule now. Alsager's menagerie of assorted metamorphic human animals that were actually humans, a few animals that sometimes pretended to be humans, and all shades in between, came barreling out of the castle like a mass escape from a zoological garden. They made a sweeping turn as they came out of the guard post building at the outer end of the drawbridge and headed as a broad wave of claws and teeth toward the attacking force, tending their route over a little to avoid the powdery pile of former zombies and the few still animated examples that were floundering around as the holy fire devoured them. They really are terrifically predictable, noted Professor Stone, and raised a very pistol. A moment later, a white star shell was rising into the heavens. The warbirds barely needed the signal. They had already spotted the new threat and were responding to it as had been decided earlier in the day. Striking dragons swung around the battlefield while Spirit of 76 and Buzzbomb formed up in the echelon, Diaboom's bird leading and to the north. As they got within 200 yards of the lycanthrope, she put her Entomopter's nose down and opened fire. Contrary to popular expectation, machine gun fire rarely causes great gouts of earth to plume up dramatically under the impact of a few grains of lead. Instead, they usually insert themselves under the sod with little fuss, but for perhaps a few bits of soil being tossed into the air, shook loose by the admittedly fierce transfer of energy from the deaccelerating bullet. On a hard surface, impacts may be seen, and on a baked earthy surface, perhaps you might get something like those little fountains of dust so beloved of the cinematicians. Alsager's lycanthropes were offered no such aesthetically pleasing sight. The twin lines of fire stitched the ground towards them, and it was only the tracer rounds mixed into the gun's ammunition that made them think that perhaps they weren't standing in the ideal place. A kitsune was struck and fell wordlessly, for not all lycanthropes share the werewolf's resistance to non-silver munitions. Indeed, one of the wolfmen stopped and threw up his arms in contemptuous challenge.
Your feeble bullets cannot harm me, he cried in a voice half-human bellow and half-lupine howl. Unhappily, these words were to be his last words, as the Entomopter's guns bore an ammunition mix that included 10% silver rounds. Still, at least he found a sort of immortality as an amusing anecdote bandied around in the more esoteric circles. Devlin Alsager roared at his troops.
Get out of the way, you fools! Up against the riverbank!
There was a surge in their ranks as they obeyed, although whether out of obedience or simply because it was away from the line of the strafing run is open to interpretation. They crowded in close, but continued to move towards the Templar line, the sooner to be out of the confined area and into the enemy ranks where the warbirds dare not attack. So busy were they in this that none noticed the trailing warbird sashay lazily north to bring itself on a run for their new position. As it approached, valves clicked and another haze of atomized liquid from the Entomopter's crop spraying nozzles started to drift down. The mist was thick this time, a product of the Copperhead's larger cargo capacity, and dense wreaths of spray fell upon the shape-changers. Alsager shook his clawed fist as the aircraft passed over him, barely 30 feet above.
Holy water?
He shouted derisively.
What's this? You think we're like Misericord's useless creatures? Or...
He laughed, a horrid barking noise.
You're blessing us. How sweet, how thoughtful, how...
It was then that the scent of the mist finally reached his nostrils. He had been aware of something almost immediately, but had dismissed it as a part of the Entomopter's exhaust. Now he knew differently. The Spirit of 76 was venting aviation fuel spirit. He saw Striking Dragon and Buzzbomb bearing down on his troop, already committed to a strafing run.
"Shit,"
he said, which was less amusing as last words go.
"Shit, shit, 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 shit."
Mink's guns blazed, their bullet streams blazed with tracers, and when the bright rounds penetrated the bank of fuel vapor floating over the lycanthropes, the air blazed too, albeit briefly. Cabal had explained that such a mist would not merely burn, but would explode. He had been exactly right. The timing of the attack run had been precise. The lead anemopter was already a quarter of a mile away with its throttles fully open to escape the blast, and the aircraft assigned to light the cloud had banked up and clear as soon as its short burst of fire, dense with tracer rounds, was airborne. The blast was perfunctory and brutal. Those directly beneath were crushed and burned. Those to the edges thrown by the massive overpressure wave. A Rakshasa, screaming like a cat, was flung clean across the river moat, cartwheeling as it flew, to smash into the castle wall and fall silently to the ground. Those who were not burnt had their lungs exploded inside their chest, their eardrums shattered, their eyeballs crushed. The violence of the concussion startled even the attacking force, despite their expectation of it, and the firing from their ranks halted. The shape-changers lay mangled and more than dead. Here and there was movement. A maimed werebear here, a disemboweled werefox there, clung pitifully to their lives. Ensuring their weapons were charged with silver, the attackers advanced to deal with the survivors. The line faltered as, from the veil of smoke and steam boiled from flesh and grass, a huge figure emerged at a charge. Its hide burnt, and the tussock of coarse black hair between its shoulders alight. The werebull, minotaur incarnate, bore down upon the shocked ranks of the secret societies. There was a remarkably loud bang. The werebull carried on running for several more steps until its metabolism regretfully admitted that even its automatic processes were having a few problems getting along now that the werebull's brain had been comprehensively liquefied, at which point the creature fell forward nervelessly to lie twitching on the sod. Slowly, it started to metamorphose into its human form, an accounts payable clerk from a stationery company in Basingstoke. Atropos Straka patted the breech of the borrowed Holland & Holland 577 Nitro Express elephant gun appreciatively. The effect of the massive 750-grain bullet had been most gratifying. Her shoulder would be sorely bruised come the morning, she knew, but that was better than being gored by a werebull. The necromancer Cabal had offered the gun to her when he had decided that it was too bulky a weapon to be using during the infiltration, and, in any case, the Ministerium's heavy forces would be outside the castle if all went to plan. She nodded to those nearby, many of whom were twitching their heads in an effort to dissipate the ringing in their ears.
"I like this gun," said Atropos Straka. "It is a good gun."
Professor Stone glanced back and saw Korka Olvir-Dottir looking nervously ahead. She caught his glance and gave him a smile and a thumbs up, but her smile was wan. He could hardly blame her. Cabal had dissected the likely waves of the attack for them in his interminable, frequently supercilious, but, it transpired, very accurate briefing. He had dismissed the undead as almost beneath his notice, the lycanthropes as only slightly more problematical, and he had proposed ways of wiping them out quickly and effectively that had proved themselves most dramatically. Then he had given his view of what the third wave must be, and told them,
"This is likely when you will die."
Johannes Cabal might have many positive attributes, thought the professor, but rousing pep talks did not feature anywhere among them.